let's set a scene for a second. Imagine that you're in the car, you're hopefully not, but you're distracted by your cell phone. You end up getting into a car accident, okay? An ambulance comes, they get to you, they take you to the hospital. You end up being diagnosed with some kind of internal injury where you have to be rushed to the OR by surgeons for them to do surgery. What kind of blood tests do you think that the doctors need to run in order to be able to safely take you through that surgery? So I'm going to say one of the most important blood tests that they can do is testing your coagulation system. Now, your coagulation system in your body runs in a very delicate balance where you either have too little clotting or bleeding, where you can get spontaneous hemorrhage, or you can get too much clotting, which can lead to thrombosis, things like strokes and heart attacks. Now, there are a number of things that can affect the system. That includes that trauma from the car accident. It can include things like cancer, drugs that you're on, severe infections, implants, stents, and also what we're going to focus on today, which are anticoagulants. So anticoagulants are very important, and they're very frequently prescribed by doctors in order to prevent this increase in blood clotting. Now, traditional oral anticoagulants, which some of you may be accustomed to, are either warfarin or Coumadin or heparin. Now, these drugs have been around for multiple decades, and they're very, very useful. But there are a number of things that could be improved upon them, including decreasing the dosage frequency and even increasing safety to prevent things like too much anticoagulation and spontaneous hemorrhage. So there's a new class of drugs that have been developed over the past few years called direct oral anticoagulants. Now, these are just a few examples of some of them. You may have seen commercials for them, so Eliquis, Xarelto, Pradaxa, and many of you may have family members or be on these drugs yourself for a number of reasons. The reasons that these drugs are on the market and are being increasingly prescribed is because they are said to increase safety, and also you could do less dosing frequency as well to increase patient compliance. Now, DOACs are the fastest growing sector of the global anticoagulant market, and it's estimated to be almost a $30 billion market by 2021. Now, this is from a Nature paper, but back in 2008, the DOACs, which are in red, were only about 5% of prescriptions from the anticoagulant market, and by 2017, they're estimated to be up to over 40% of the market. Now, many of you have also most likely seen the commercials for class action lawsuits against some of these new drugs because of some of the adverse events that happen, including spontaneous bleeding and hemorrhage. These class action suits have been for hundreds of millions of dollars, and some of them have already been settled as well. In addition to that, because of the adverse events associated with these drugs, many of them are actually currently on the FDA watch list for the last quarter of 2016. That doesn't mean we're going to stop prescribing them. They're very important, and they serve a very important as a clinical tool for helping people. But that means maybe we need to look at how we're prescribing them and monitoring them. Now, although these drugs have been studied and deemed to be safer in terms of less risk of acute fatal hemorrhages, so things like spontaneous brain bleeds, some patients have up to twice the amount of risk for having chronic GI bleeding through the intestine. So although in 2013, most of these DOACs were deemed to be safe by the FDA and they didn't recommend routine monitoring, now by 2016, because of all of these adverse effects that are being reported as they're being used more widely, they're on the watch list, and there are many companies trying to make monitoring tests for these drugs. Now, major bleeding events could surge because these DOACs are being prescribed on such an increasing basis. And one of the caveats to this is, although we have conventional coagulation tests for things like warfarin and heparin, such as PT, PTT, INR, some of those may seem familiar, those actually aren't sensitive enough to work with these new oral anticoagulants. So unless you have a very, very high level of these drugs in your system, these conventional tests aren't good. So doctors have no good way of detecting whether these drugs are in your system and if they're in safe levels or not at the moment. Now, as we've already stated, these DOACs represent a giant share of the global anticoagulant market, and there are a number of them also currently in clinical trials now. They have the same mechanism of action, but they just require less frequent dosing and are deemed to be potentially a bit safer as well. So let's go back to this example. So you're in the ambulance, you're taken to the hospital. What if a doctor had a way to be able to detect whether one of these drugs was in your system and could even potentially give you some medications to reverse the effects of these anticoagulants before you go into a surgery, and to make it safer for you in that surgery so that you don't have risk of postoperative or intraoperative bleeding? So here, we've been developing a multiplex test for precision detection and management of coagulation, specifically for patients on these new oral anticoagulants. We've spent the last few years developing an assay method and a microfluidic approach where we take either whole blood or plasma, we add our agonist to it, put it in this microfluidic chip, and we get a readout in less than 10 minutes. Right now it's at about 5 minutes. And we can detect whether there's 10A inhibitor in your blood, which is one of the drugs, or a 2A inhibitor in your blood, and also differentiate between the two. So if a person comes into the emergency room and they're unconscious or they've had a stroke, you can actually do one of these tests and detect if that drug is in their system and which one it is. Therefore, you can tailor your specific therapies, and you could potentially give some of the reversal agents for these drugs that are now on the market. So right now, our microfluidic assay is done with manual sample loading, and we do manual skilled results assessment. Tomorrow, what we hope to do is be able to actually integrate this entire platform to be able to automate it and make it as a simple digital results readout. We have our technology disclosed to the TLO. We just ran our first set of patient samples a few weeks ago when we were able to detect 100% of the samples that had 10A inhibitors in them and distinguish them from factor 2As. So now over the next few months, we're going to be running a higher number of patient samples and doing validations. And then the next step after that is making that integrated point of care device. And we're going to be actively pursuing strategic partnerships to be able to move forward with prototype manufacturing and development. We have a wonderful team between MIT, MGH, and Brigham and Women's, and many doctors, PhDs, microfluidic specialists, assay specialists. And I hope that if anyone has any questions, feel free to come to the poster and talk to me. And we'd love to hear some feedback.